Oh,
And of course, this
absolutely.
generation is completely, they're digital natives. But
Yeah.
one thing never changes is that they need real human interaction
Mm.
from mentors in their life. Especially my students, some of them didn't grow up with a stable household. And I think finding a way to just be there bodily for people, which I know is hard coming out of a pandemic, but just human interaction never changes. The social nature of human interaction just doesn't change, especially at that age when um, students may. Of course, we always talk about college students think they know everything, and a lot of them do act like that. But I think inside they're looking for people to look up to.
Well, Reverend Dr. Drew Holland, it is a pleasure to have you join us on Faith in the Folds. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, Kevin. Thanks for having me. Always great to see your face.
Yeah, good to see you. Coming from the bustling metropolis of Pulaski, Tennessee, a town with infamous history that we won't get into if you don't need to. But
let's not.
we won't get into there. Drew, it is a delight to be able to talk to you this morning about some of your experiences teaching Bible primarily, right? Not Bible and religion, but mainly Bible, right? At a state school, yeah?
Yeah, well, more than just Bible. They wrote me into teaching philosophy. I've got bioethics next semester, so
Wow.
sometimes I'm learning with my students, which is a lot of fun. So as a lifelong learner, I get paid to learn and to pass the cool things I learn on to my students.
That's great. Paid to learn. What a gig, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
My brother-in-law is professor of Spanish at my alma mater, and he used to joke that when he was little, he would say that he wanted to be an ologist, just somebody who studied. And so I can appreciate that. So we've alluded to the fact that you are currently teaching at a state school. Drew, where do you teach? You mentioned what you teach. How long have you been teaching? Help us kind of get to know you a little bit before we dig into some of the stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So I teach at the University of Tennessee Southern here in lovely Pulaski, Tennessee. We are the newest member of the University of Tennessee system.
Okay.
We merged with the UT system this past fall in 2021. Prior to that, we were Martin Methodist College, and I started teaching at Martin Methodist as an adjunct back in fall of 2018. I was serving as an associate pastor about an hour away in Huntsville, Alabama, and had the opportunity to teach on top of serving a local church, and really fell in love with teaching, and had the opportunity, once we merged with the UT system, the provost invited me to come on full time. So I've actually been full time since last spring semester, so January of 2021. So kind of anticipating the merger, and so I'm assistant professor. It's my tenure status, and I'm also the program director for religion and philosophy. So it's been a great last year or so teaching full time, and really enjoyed it. And also been rather interesting with this merger into the UT system, going from a small private Christian college to a state school that is growing.
Yeah, definitely. I would imagine too that that has a whole number of challenges and things, and that you would probably have some insight into higher ed that that could be pretty interesting. If we come to it later, I'd like to dig into some of that.
Absolutely.
What got you interested in teaching, and particularly like Bible and ministry and things like that? Normally, we were talking before we got going here. normally when I think somebody wants to be a pastor or a minister, or they want to be a professor of Bible and religion, and it's normal for folks in our church tradition to go to a Christian university, but that is not the case for you, right? You didn't even go to a Christian university, and so how did you kind of get to this route of doing what you're doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I grew up in a family that we were United Methodist, and that's my, I'm a cradle Methodist. But I wouldn't say that my family was
I hadn't
heavily
heard that before.
involved.
That's
Oh
funny.
yeah, that's
You
due to
and
its
you and
name.
some of our other cohort mates from Asbury. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, so but the family I grew up in was not particularly involved in church. I mean, we would go to 11 o'clock worship on Sunday morning at our large suburban United Methodist church.
Yeah.
Very rarely went to Sunday school. I didn't do youth group, but there was something about worship that enticed me from a very early age. I was sharing with you earlier that I remember being about 8 years old, third grade, listening to the preacher preach. And I remember thinking, like, I think I could do better than this guy. So it started off, my call, I think, started off with my arrogance, and like most things, God kind of works in spite of us. But through the years, people would say that several folks from church and friends would say, I kind of discerned in you some gifts for ministry. And as I went to college and became more involved in a local church, I kind of did the opposite of most folks. When I went to college, I got attached to a local church, and that's really where I started to pick up my, at least kind of get momentum with the idea that maybe God is calling me to full-time ministry. So I got involved with local church ministry in college, and had several folks just kind of push me in that direction. And at first I thought, I think I want to make money. Again, I grew up in kind of a secular environment. Everybody in my family was in business in some way, shape, or form. And so I tried that for a couple of years out of college, and realized I'm a terrible salesman. And it was just kind of, for me personally, I found the work that I was doing, I was working in banking, as kind of soul-sucking work. Not that there aren't people who are called to that kind of, and my wife is now a banker herself, but and she is very much called to that. She has an enormous amount of integrity in what she does and represents Christ so well in her work. But for me, it's just I could not reconcile who God had called me to be with that work. So I went back to seminary at the last urging of a friend, saying, you really have, like, while you can, do this. And so I went to seminary at Duke, and while I was there, I was still kind of toying, like, is God calling me to local ministry, or is God calling me to academia? Because I really love to learn. And I really, especially through the end of my college time, I thought about the idea of going into some kind of academia. And it became more clear, God revealed this to me as I was in seminary, that I needed to have a foot in both worlds. I needed to be in the academy and in the local church. And what that looked like very clearly, going through seminary, was that I needed to first serve a local church, and I needed to go through the ordination process, which is pretty lengthy in my denomination. And so I did that, and served a local church in Birmingham, Alabama, which was closer to my wife's home. That's how we ended up in North Alabama. I'm originally from North Carolina, but had a great ministry there for 4 years, loved it. And then the bishop was like, okay, it's time for you to go, because in our polity, we have a bishop who tells us where to go.
Y'all move around quite a bit, right?
We do. Thankfully, not as much as we used to.
Okay.
But that was also kind of a breaking point of I just had my first child. My wife and I, really, she had the child, but we had our first child. And so I was like, okay, time's running out if I'm actually going to go take the academic route as well. And got accepted to Asbury, and went there, had a great 3 years of residence there, in which I met fine folks like yourself, and returned back to local ministry for a little while. And then, as I mentioned before, I was adjuncting and serving a local church, and the opportunity kind of opened up to teach full time, which has enabled me to really balance the two better. It was very hard to serve a local church and adjunct on the side. I didn't have as much flexibility to do that. But now I have the opportunity to teach full time, and then I have a lot more flexibility, especially in the summers. I have weekends available. So, I teach adult Sunday school classes at our local church. I fill pulpits, get to do things like this,
Yeah.
and I be on podcasts, which I've done a couple times. So it's really a great setup, and I'm very blessed to be where I am. So that's a long story to kind of about my background. I could say more, but I won't bore you.
No. That's great. I can't help but still see the preacher in you for giving such a long. No, I'm kidding.
It never really goes away.
Right. Yeah. Um, no, I'm always fascinated by, like I said, by people who go to state schools, which you attend the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
Yep.
Which is it all, and so like by way of reminder for our audience and perhaps for you. So I'm in Corpus Christi, Texas, and it always trips me up just for a second when people down here say UT, because they mean that school in Austin with that ugly color orange.
Hey, just remember, we were here first, and there would not be the other UT without this UT.
1794.
Tennessee Volunteers.
Exactly.
1794.
1794, University of Tennessee. Yeah.
Without
so anyway,
Tennessee Volunteers, there would be no Texas.
There would be no Texas,
Yep.
which I am I'm quick to remind my friends. I don't know, for those who are watching, you might be able to see over here in the corner. That is a Tennessee state flag just hanging in the corner of the screen. But yeah, it fascinates me. The people who were telling you, hey, maybe you think ministry might be a good route for you. Were those trusted friends? Were those people in a campus ministry program? Like what I'm just curious, what sort of precipitated those conversations for it even to be relevant for them to tell you that?
Usually it was leading a Bible study or just, kind of giving my insights in a Bible study. But the folks who were telling me this were mentors. These were usually adults who had volunteered their time in our college ministry and had a heart for college students. And one of them was a really close friend who was my age, but I've always kind of seen him as a mentor, really a leader, a spiritual leader in my own life. So if enough of those kind of authoritative voices speak into you, eventually it gets your attention.
Yeah, very much so. I think I had mentioned this. Maybe I told you after I finished up my undergrad degree, I was just a history major. I was thinking, well, I think I might want to go the academic route, but I need to get serious about school, right? I had A-level aspirations and C-level work ethic. So if you average that out, I had to be average coming out of undergrad. And it's like, oh, I should probably. I could get a master's of science and education here at Harding. And that way, like I could already have a master's degree in hand and use it as a big GPA boost. I was in the midst of all that and starting to date Linnea. And so I was thinking, I could, instead of academic route, I could teach high school history and social studies, and had a series of conversations with mentors and was talking to them about this. And like, Kevin, one of them especially said, Kevin, you clearly have a gift for language. It would be a shame to waste that, because he knew that I had taken undergrad at first year of grad school. I'd taken 7 semesters of New Testament Greek just because I thought it was fun and enjoyed it. And so, yeah,
that means you were our one sick puppy.
I loved it though. I absolutely loved it. And it paid off at Asbury, right? Like it was great to be able to jump in there and not feel like I'd missed a beat or anything. And I definitely appreciate too your acknowledgement of really the need. Or let me ask, would you say it's like a drive, or do you feel like it's like a sacred duty to, while at the same time have your job there at UT South, to also teach adult Bible classes and things like that? Like, do you feel that, is it fair to describe that as a drive or a need or something?
I just couldn't imagine myself not doing it.
Yeah.
It's kind of just one of those things where I feel like this is what I was put on this earth to do, to really just have a foot in both worlds. And I don't know if I would feel lazy necessarily if I didn't do it, but I just would feel incomplete.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I teach almost every quarter. We're on a pretty strict quarter system here, 3 months, and we're switching classes and teachers and everything. And since we started back adult classes the last February 2021, because we're still kind of coming out of COVID at that point. So that was a short quarter. I taught 3 of the 4 quarters last year, and that one quarter that I didn't teach, I ended up substituting like 4 or 5 Sunday mornings for people who weren't. But the rest of the time, I was just kind of antsy. It's like, all right, like
Yep.
this is good. I'm glad I'm in this class, but yeah, I kind of feel like I should be doing that. So
Yeah. Yep.
all right, Drew, let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
Although we might come back to that kind of thing, because I think that conversation, that route that we were taking, was pretty fascinating. What students do you typically teach? Freshmen, sophomores, juniors, seniors, grad students? Where do you generally teach? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, good question. It's mostly what we call the gen ed classes.
Okay.
So these are required courses, or at least the students are now required to take a certain amount of hours in the humanities, and religion falls within the humanities.
Okay.
When we were a small private Christian school, everyone was required to take 6 hours of Bible.
Yeah.
And so everybody went through one of our Bible classes. But now it's an option. It's just kind of part of a buffet that students
Sure.
can choose from. And so most of the classes I teach are freshman, sophomore level classes. And then every now and then I get to teach more upper level classes, which is fun. But it's really, I really enjoy being on the front end of biblical education for a lot of these students. It's really cool to see their eyes open, and to see that the text is not as scary as some of them thought it was.
Yeah. All right. So that segues very nicely into my next question. So because you've been pastoring either full time or just kind of teaching, Sunday mornings and things like that for a while now, how would you say that your state school students' knowledge of the Bible compares with the average layperson's or the average parishioner's Bible knowledge? Similar, different? What have you seen so far?
I'd say slightly below what
The
the
students
average
is slightly
layperson's.
below?
Yeah, the students is slightly below what
Okay.
the average layperson's is. My students typically, even if they didn't grow up in church, which a lot of them haven't, they know stories,
Yeah.
but they don't know how it all pieces together. They don't know the history of Israel. They don't know much about the rise of early Christianity. They certainly don't know a lot about the Greco-Roman world, or before that, the ancient Near East,
Yeah.
and how that plays into the biblical narrative. And then there, I felt this not very long ago myself. I remember being a first year student in seminary, being completely afraid of the Old Testament, and what I might learn about it. Because again, I knew stories like Jonah and the whale, even though it's a big fish.
Sure.
The whale.
Right. Let's be clear, right?
Noah's Ark and all
This
this
is
stuff.
not a mammal. No, I'm kidding.
That's right. Yes. And so, I mean, I had a lot of trepidation about studying Old Testament, and then ended up getting my PhD in it, because I just over time found it just so utterly fascinating. And so I love to share that with my students. I kind of, and I think it's really cool when a student realizes this as well. It's like, oh, this wasn't as frightening as I thought, or this makes a lot of sense, or I think it's really interesting. So to see that light come on for students is really cool for me. And for me, it's even cooler personally to see them have that light come on at an earlier age than it did for me.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting that you mentioned being afraid of the Old Testament, and then I'm glad you mentioned that you ended up dissertating in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
We won't name names, but I'm just remembering being in your dissertation defense and some of the funny things that were said by an examiner. Anyway,
Oh, let's not go there.
Yeah, but we what are you mentioned some of the things that they might not know about, particularly ancient Near East, Greco-Roman world. I'm curious, you said that they know some of the stories. Like, do they know about Noah's floating zoo? Do they know, like, have they heard of Moses? Like, what are some of the typical stories that they've heard of?
Yeah, I mean, so Noah's Ark, they know the name Moses,
Yeah.
may know a few stories depending on how engaged they were in church growing up. Um, they may know the names of these books of the Bible, but not necessarily know how really what's the difference between, say, Deuteronomy and Leviticus.
Yeah.
And certainly they don't know the grand narrative of how it all ties together.
Yeah.
So filling in that content is mostly what I see myself doing, at least on the biblical study side. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how you put that. They don't know the grand narrative. I've been in congregational ministry now for coming up on like 7 something years. And I've been in church for 36 and a half years. And so I
Such a
think it's
baby.
fair to say that your students aren't alone in not really understanding the grand narrative of the Old Testament. I mentioned earlier that I've been using Dr. Sandra Richter's book, The Epic of Eden, to start today. At the time of recording, it's Wednesday, and so I've been using that to start a new Wednesday class. And I love how just right out of the gate she's like, hey, this is a story of redemption, whole Bible story of redemption, and I'm going to show you what redemption really means in its time, in its original context, and then I'll give you a sense of the depth of what's going on here. So yeah, I'm not at all surprised that they know only a handful of things. It really doesn't seem like it's much different from the average person in the pew.
Yeah, I would say, again, I don't think a lot of my students' knowledge of the Bible is all that different than mine was my first year of seminary. And part of that was because I didn't go to a confessional school for undergrad, and really just had been involved in church, and but even not very deeply so. So
Yeah.
I can kind of feel some kinship with my students in a lot of ways.
Yeah. You mentioned something just a minute ago that I thought was, I don't know if it was a slip of the tongue, but if it wasn't, I thought, no, that's a really interesting thought. I want to dig into that. You mentioned being afraid of what you might learn about the Old Testament, which,
Yeah.
I mean, we're rolling through our questions pretty smoothly here. And it's never my intention that we just kind of formulaically deal with these, but it just so happens that my next question was, what preconceived ideas do your students tend to have about the Old Testament? I feel like it's relevant here, since you indicated that you might be afraid to
Yeah.
learn something about the Old Testament. Can you help us dig into that a little bit?
Oh, sure. I mean, you've got an ancient culture that is distanced in time and place from our current culture, so hard to understand. I mean, the big one's also always violence, right? It's always, is the Old Testament God a God of violence?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking my very first class in seminary, I was like, maybe the Old Testament God's a different God than the New Testament God. And then I was in a church history class, like the very first week, my professor was like, oh, there's this guy named Marcy, and he was declared a heretic because he thought there were two different gods. And I was like, oh, I'm not as smart as I think I am.
You're sitting there squirming in your chair. It's like, whew, I could have been a heretic.
Yes. And, a lot of my students, I think, come in with that notion as well.
Sure.
But I mean, there's things like, the binding of Isaac. I mean, what do you do with that? And just little narratives here or there, that suppression of women, different themes as well that run throughout the Old Testament that are just frightening, I think, for some people to, at least people of faith, to say, like, okay, do I really want to learn more about this, or is ignorance bliss?
Yeah. Yeah. And it not to pick at the low hanging fruit of the excesses of part of our culture these days, but I think generally, there's a greater sensitivity towards, violence towards, women, or statements about sexuality, and what is appropriate and what is not. And so, and then, like, the Old Testament does not at all shy away from any of that kind of stuff. Like, not condoning violence against women in any way, but it's just reporting it And so like, have you had any of your students ask questions about those kinds of things? And like, what have maybe some of those questions been?
I think generally the students who investigate those questions are they're usually faithful students and curious students, and they come out with some more nuance
Mhm.
than they had before, because we do tend to put our modern presuppositions on the biblical text. As you were talking, it just made me think of something I heard from the English professor Karen Swallow Prior, who studies British literature, but is also a very faithful Christian. I heard her in a podcast say that our society is more Victorian than it is Christian sometimes,
Oh,
and our
what did you mean by
sensibilities
that?
at least just that our sensibilities are we don't talk about things, we don't mention things that are improper, certainly in mixed company.
Mhm.
um, and even those definitions of what are proper um, come from they come from more polite, genteel society than they do from the Bible, which is, as you said, is very descriptive in what happens.
Yeah.
Um, Not always that it's condoning what happens, but does not shy away from the harsh realities of life. And I think in many ways, I know I grew up kind of protected from some of these harsh realities,
Yeah.
and many of us do. We live in a very comfortable society, but that's not the way of the ancient world. And it's important to as much as we can be sympathetic to the worldview of the ancient writers. And that's what I've really, that's where I feel like I've grown most in my studies of the Bible, is to say, okay, this is a different time, a different place. Does that make what they're saying wrong? No. Does it make what they're saying different? Many times, yes. And so we have to study as much as we can about their world and be sympathetic to the worldview that they have, and know that they do speak into some realities that may be different than our own, but try to understand that. I mean, I feel like you talked about you being a history major and studying history, and for me, history is all about being sympathetic to other humans across time and space. And I think it's certainly valid to study the Old Testament, New Testament as works of history in order to
Yeah.
be sympathetic to the authors.
Yeah. Yeah. I've in my pastoral duties here, I think I've grown, maybe not just in my pastoral duties, but in my pastoral duties and in my studies, academic studies. I think I've grown some some in my ability to give grace to folks, um, because there have been times when I've seen how much grace I've received.
Mm.
And when I'm aware, it's like, oh man, yeah, it wears me out that my child continues to do this thing that I have told him several times. Hey, if you do this thing, it will hurt yourself. And yet, for years, I struggled with X sin, knowing full well how it was self-destructive. And so finally willing to say, man, may God be with you as you work through this. And most importantly, being able to come to realization that I think what's expected of a lot of folks is to be faithful with what they have at the moment. And so what the culture, again, I mentioned Sandra Richter's book, The Epic of Eden, which I'm working through. The culture, like she starts out at the gate talking about the culture there being described by patriarchy, being patrilineal and patrilocal.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, when you hear that word patriarchy these days, especially in an academic environment, get the defibrillator ready. Somebody's about to pass out.
Yeah, for sure.
But the patriarchy described there in the Old Testament still comes up with laws like don't glean to the edge of your field. And, so the orphan, the widow, and the stranger may eat of the produce of the land. The whole issue of levirate marriage, and God describing himself as the God of orphans and widows and things like that. It's like, all right, say what you want about the excesses of patriarchy, right?
Yeah, well, and then
But
you've got the daughters of Zelophehad who get to inherit land before Israel even enters the land. There's some boundary pushing that goes on.
who knew the Old Testament was so
But-
progressive, right?
yeah.
But anyway, like, it's that kind of stuff that I am learning and seeing and thinking, wow, it's like there's some really harsh stuff, and there's moments where you think, oh wow, like this is surprising. If we're going to say the whole thing is is wicked or patriarchal and use that in the most negative way possible, like I actually kind of miss some things that are surprisingly equal and important. So, I don't know if you want to go with that anymore, but
no, I mean, I'm constantly surprised by that, studying the Old Testament, New Testament as well, just especially because a lot of what I study is the cultural background. And in studies of violence, I mean, there's no, for instance, that's just as an example, there's so many things that when you read it in the Old Testament, that every man, woman, child, cow was slaughtered. It's like, golly, what do we do with that? But then you contrast that with Neo-Assyrian annals, which discuss an entire field being laid with corpses, such that you had to put bodies in the river, and the river was dammed up with bodies, and the river was flowing with blood. That are just far more gruesome. And you think, okay, maybe ancient Israel was a product of their day and time, but also did not focus on some of these issues, like excessive violence. And then I could go on forever about violence itself, but you could extrapolate that out to lots of different modern issues. And you can see even in ancient Israel's witness a certain ethic of care, of universal love for all humankind, that is kind of bubbling beneath the surface, and that certainly explodes on the scene with the telos of the law in Jesus Christ. So.
Yeah. I was waiting for you to say, with the arrival of the good stuff, aka the New Testament.
Well,
Okay.
Jesus really didn't say anything new, Kevin. I mean, he mostly just quoted the Old Testament and just kind of brought the story to, just kind of recapitulated the story.
You've been hanging out with our friend John Cook of Asbury Seminary, who likes to call the Old Testament, what he calls the New Testament, what the appendix.
Yeah. I think it was Bill Arnold. He calls it that too. So, yeah,
wow, man, I used to think so highly of these guys. In addition to the questions about violence and other hot topics, what has surprised you most about teaching undergrads?
That's a good question. I would just say, wow, let me think about this. Probably, I would say, even though it shouldn't be surprising, it is their biblical knowledge. Simply because I have to kind of think back to myself at that age and what I knew. But I've been studying this and immersed in Scripture for so long, from an academic perspective, that I take so much for granted. I take so much knowledge for granted, and so many cool things that people have taught me throughout the years, and great insights that God has revealed to me, and mostly others that they've passed on to me, and so I just feel like I kind of find myself slowing down a lot to say, okay, let me break this down. Right? Let me just pretend like you're an alien from another planet who is encountering this thing called the Bible. So it's not really on my students; it's more on me to, as a teacher, to slow down and simplify certain concepts.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I think it's fair to say that some of the most basic things that are just commonplace in the Old Testament are things like sacrifice and Oh goodness. So yeah, you get to the binding of Isaac. And that in itself is so bizarre. Why would I intentionally let go of this thing that is good for me? What is the value in that? And how why does God or the gods, or like, how does all that play out? Yeah, I can see how there would be lots of questions. And yeah, you described yourself being, you tell them, be an alien, or pretend like you're an alien from another planet. It really feels like that sometimes, cracking open the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. I didn't plan this question, so gotcha. But
Go for it. Try me.
I'm just curious. When you get to the primeval history in Genesis, so typically described as Genesis 1 through 11, do your students tend to have stronger notions about what those chapters mean and how we have to understand them, or are they still kind of an open book with that section as well?
I think that section, they're pretty much firmly established in their beliefs, at least the ones that I've engaged with.
Yeah.
So my students here, we're here in South Central Tennessee, which I know you don't like the phrase South Central.
No, well, nobody calls it that.
it.
But for people who aren't from Tennessee, that makes sense. It's not the Tennessee colloquialism. You're in Middle Tennessee. Yeah. You're like 5 minutes away from Alabama, but still.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, we call it South Central. That's our kind of in our slogan, but I don't. Yeah. Anyways, but our context, we're pretty rural, small town, and so I've found that we have pretty much two demographics that we draw from, religiously speaking. We have students who grew up in a very fundamentalist, literal environment where Scripture is history, science.
Yeah.
All of those kind of modern presuppositions that we put on the scriptural narrative. Or we have kids who have never darkened the door of a church. So, I grew up in a suburban area of a large city, around a lot of people who are well educated. I'm very blessed to have gotten some education myself.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very different context than a lot of my students, most of whom are first generation college students, and have, aside from their religious upbringing, have not studied the Bible in an academic way.
Yeah. Quick question. How big is UT South?
We're just under 1,000 students right now, but we're growing.
Yeah. So for people who hear UT and they might think, oh, well, like the University of Tennessee is however many thousands of students, or UT Martin, or what are the other UTs?
Chattanooga.
That's right. Yeah, UT Chattanooga.
Campus,
yeah. So like those, they might think those schools like, oh yeah, like there's several thousand students there, and like y'all are just over 1,000.
That's much larger than we have been.
Yeah, well, and that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So anyway, still very much a small school.
Yeah.
And would draw, unsurprisingly, the crowd that you're talking about there. So go ahead.
Sure. No, and I think when it comes, your question was about the primeval history, and I think you either have students who take it as historical narrative, in the way that we think of historical narrative, in the kind of Greco-Roman sense of history, or they really have not engaged with it at all and think that it's I don't know, just rather foolish.
Sure. So yeah. It's just a story. Yeah.
Right. So so it's very little in between, not a lot of nuance there. So I actually spent a lot of time on just Genesis 1 and 2 with my students, and I try not to prescribe any particular reading, which I can't do in a state school anyways.
Exactly.
But I lay the certain options out there, and just try to be as descriptive as I possibly can, and let the students make up their mind. And a lot of them are surprised at the different options out there, and even those who grew up in church, I think are like, oh, I've never seen that aspect of it, or I've never heard it read from that perspective. So I think it's cool just to be able to present different options to my students and let them make up their mind. what they
Yeah.
believe.
Yeah. I wonder, is it appropriate to talk to your students about about reading the text in ways in which they were intended to be understood, as opposed to, for example, like, and this is something that I tend to think about when I come to Genesis 1 and 2. It's tempting for us to read it as, like scientific manual. It's like, this is scientifically what happened. But that imposes on the text a way of thinking that is foreign to the worldview there, to the original audience, to the authors and editors who have gone back and kind of worked with the text. And if anybody in the audience is concerned about me mentioning editors, it's like, well, Moses probably didn't write about his own death, right? And anyway, so, but there's like, do you mention any of that to them as you go through all that?
Again, I see part of my job as helping my students be more sympathetic to ancient contexts. And so what I do, especially in the creation stories, but also, even going through Genesis 6 through 9 and the flood story, is I bring in the other ancient Near Eastern texts. I try to say, basically, they're not writing, the author or authors of the Genesis primeval narratives are not writing as 21st century moderns. They are writing more with the worldview of these other texts in mind. So here's the Enuma Elish. Here is the Memphite theology from ancient Egypt. Here is this Babylonian creation story, or here is another creation story from Memphis at the Heliopolitan text. So if I could set that broader cognitive worldview, for me at least, I would think and I hope that helps my students understand and kind of put Genesis 1 through 2 in a different frame than the one from which they come.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you put it in when you compare it with these other texts. There, from a pastoral standpoint, there's a lot. There's a lot of what I would say is substantial difference, to the point where the differences make a difference. As reading these as Judeo-Christian literature, the way in which they're intended to be read, they, I think there's an argument to be made, right, that these are, if not interacting directly with those other texts, they're at least speaking in ways that deal with the ideas of these other worldviews that are represented. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a essay comparing Genesis 1 and some other creation texts recently, so it's a little fresh on my mind. But the conclusion I come to is that they share these concepts. They know this conceptual worldview, but they don't seem to borrow directly from a lot of these texts. The Enuma Elish is the one that probably gets the most play in comparison to Genesis 1, but I think there's probably a closer comparison to be made from the Memphite theology, where you have the god Ta, who creates the world through speech, for instance. And so there's a similarity there with Genesis 1. But yeah, so these kind of concepts are familiar to the authors of these creation stories. But they're certainly putting their own perspective of their God, and their God makes a difference. Like you said, the differences make a difference. And I mean, just the mere fact that you've got one God in play rather than a series of God. You've got polytheism in Mesopotamia. You've got more of what we might call henotheism in Egypt, where you have manifestations or various manifestations of the sun god. It makes a difference to have one God who's kind of in charge of all of this. And that sets the tone. And also you've got this really gracious creation in both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and a very intimate relationship between humankind and God. that you may get overtones of in Egypt, but not nearly to the extent that you get it in ancient Israel. So yeah, I like the way you put that. The differences make a difference, and I think studying that cultural background, I think reveals more about these texts than reading them in a modern scientific or historical light.
Yeah, something that I've said recently in classes here at church, which it may be relevant for this conversation, is, I've asked the question in class: does something have to be? Can something be biologically false but still true? And people are kind of scratching their heads. Everyone's like, okay, where's Kevin going with this? It's like, okay, is Jesus literally biologically a lamb? Well, no. Okay, is Jesus the Lamb of God? Yes. Okay, so then, let's learn to appreciate what the text is trying to say on its own terms that may be relevant for Genesis 1 and 2, but that may also get you to, it may be a more pastoral conversation that might not be appropriate in a classroom setting, which, by the way, brings me to my next question here. So as a state school professor, I totally understand your job is not evangelism. I suspect you need to be careful about, letting your own beliefs go, showing your own beliefs. Yeah. But I'm curious to hear, given your regular interaction with college students, do you have any recommendations for churches and how they might be able to reach this group of what are we in? Are we in Gen Z now?
I think
are we
so.
still in Gen Z? Yeah.
I think so. I can't keep up.
Yeah. Like what would you think churches might need to do, or might need to be willing to do, or might need to be willing to listen to reach this group?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I can only speak from my context here at UT Southern. And again, our students, a lot of them come from blue collar backgrounds, first generation college students. And the biggest thing I see with my students, biggest issue they struggle with is time management. And time management plays into that as well. They've got most of the students here have jobs. They also play sports. A lot of, a lot of them, sports is what drew them. They had the opportunity to play at the small school. And so they're, for the first time in their life, they're dealing with time management issues, and no one's looking over their shoulder telling them to do work. And so, and a lot of them are struggling financially as well. But in terms of, how I think local churches can help them, with as digital as this generation is, I mean, these are digital natives. I'm a little bit older than you, but I grew up without a lot of technology. But I grew up. I was probably in middle school. We've got the internet at home. And
when did you graduate high school? Can I ask?
01.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, I was in 04. So you're my. I've got a cousin same age as you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we call us the Oregon Trail generation, which means that we're like, we
so
know
true.
enough technology to like be able to keep up with it and be comfortable with it, but we remember a time when there was not. And of course, this generation is completely, they're digital natives. But one thing never changes is that they need real human interaction from mentors in their life. Especially my students, some of them didn't grow up with a stable household. And I think finding a way to just be there bodily for people, which I know is hard coming out of a pandemic, but just human interaction never changes. The social nature of human interaction just doesn't change, especially at that age when students may. Of course, we always talk about college students think they know everything, and a lot of them do act like that. But I think inside they're looking for people to look up to. They're looking for mentorship, and sometimes we don't know how to make that. I don't have a great suggestion as to how to start those relationships. I think that's the hardest part. But just building in-person human relationships with folks.
I really like what you said there, Drew. They're looking for people to look up to. That's encouraging for somebody in my position as a minister, because it's easy for me to think, man, these teens and young adults, they don't care what a 36-year-old says. I'm an old man to these guys because I've got kids, I don't have a 4 head anymore. I've got a 5 head. It's, it's starting to head back a
Hey,
little
but
bit.
your hair color's holding them pretty steady. I'm impressed.
Drew, I'm not going to lie to you, man. You probably would have been able to keep some of that brunette in there if you hadn't raced through your doctorate as fast as you
Maybe.
did. I think you
Maybe.
finished your dissertation in like 8 months or something.
It was pretty quick, but I was motivated. What can I say?
Absolutely. But I really like what you said there. They're looking for people to look up to. And that's encouraging, because it's tempting for me to think they're not interested. It's tempting for me to think that they're not interested when wildly, or maybe I should say non-surprisingly, I've asked around some of the parents, like, hey, what would you think about kind of like a mentoring program where like, trusted adults who are like parents' age and younger would eat one-on-one with, some of the teens in the youth group. You go to Whataburger or Dairy Queen or like Five Guys or something like that. Nothing fancy, just, hey, I'm a member of this church, and it's important for teens, especially, to have adult friends who are not their parents or their youth minister, that they can actually look at and say, I'm friends with these people. Statistically, that holds that is a key component in maintaining faith through high school and on into college years, is those somewhere around 5 friendships. 5 seems to be kind of a magic number. It's fascinating that, without me sharing that with you ahead of time, and I don't know if you knew that ahead of time prior to this, that you notice that the fact that these folks are hungry for meaningful social interaction. Goodness gracious, it's almost as if we were created in such a way for us not to be isolated from each other, Drew.
Yeah, it's small wonder.
Yeah. So, Drew, is there anything else? Any other dynamite nugget you want to drop with us here?
No. I'm honored to be here, Kevin. And you listed off all the New Testament folks that you had on here, and you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel for Old Testament people. So, and I don't know, your listeners should know that that you were quite the Old Testament scholar yourself, even though you finished off in New Testament.
That's very kind.
In a
I took that
Deuteronomy seminar.
seminar.
Yeah, you did great. So
I was bummed that one other New Testament guy joined in that class, because honestly, we talked about arrogance earlier. It's like I wanted to be the one guy who was brave enough to take a Hebrew-based Deuteronomy seminar with Bill Arnold. But alas, still. Anyway, Drew, it's been a pleasure, sir. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. It's been great to be on.
All right, take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.